You are listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast with Maggie Green, episode number 328.
Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast, a podcast that celebrates cookbook readers, buyers, collectors, writers, and clubs. And now your host, cookbook author, culinary dietitian, and cookbook writing coach, Maggie Green.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. How's everybody doing today? Hope you're all doing well. And it is early on a Monday morning here in Kentucky as I record the introduction to this episode. I am getting ready to head up to the kitchen in a little bit to start my 9-day Christmas cookie baking sprint. Every December for 9 days in the middle of the month, I go on a cookie baking frenzy and prepare cookies to give as gifts, tins and platters of cookies. One of my favorite things to do this time of year. And that is what I outline and talk about and provide recipes for in my Christmas cookie baking guide. It is linked below in the show notes. Talks all about how I prepare for this baking sprint, recipes I use, and photos over the years of all the cookie boxes I have created. So if you're interested in Christmas cookies or you love Christmas cookies, head on down to the show notes, click the link, take you over to Amazon, and you can get a copy for yourself. Incidentally, this is a book that I published on Amazon in the Cookbooks on KDP course alongside my students. One of my beliefs about working as a cookbook writing coach is that I always want to be teaching and sharing and supporting my students through experiences that I have had. And I wanted to learn how to publish a book, self-publish it on Amazon. And so the best way to learn that was to teach it. And as I was teaching it, I was doing the process myself. And the Christmas cookie baking guide is the first book that I have published using that process. And I've talked about other students in my program who have successfully published books, and I am excited and have been to share their work as well. Just a very rewarding project. But now that I know how to self-publish on Amazon, who knows what the next thing will be. If you want to learn how to publish your recipes in a book, I am beginning the next cohort of Cookbooks on KDP in January. It's a 12-week program. We work together live, step by step, so that you can publish your recipes and stories in a book. So I'll put the link in the show notes also for the waitlist for Cookbooks on KDP, and you will be one of the first people to hear about it when the doors open. We will be starting again with the next 12-week group in the middle of January 2025. So you're going to want to get that on your calendar and tune in for when the doors open, and I would love to have you in the next group. Okay, so let's get to our episode today. Today, I welcome Jonathan Stevens. Jonathan is the co-owner of Hungry Ghost Bread in Northampton, Massachusetts, and is the author of the Hungry Ghost Bread book. Jonathan approaches sourdough bread with a unique philosophy that sourdough isn't a style of bread, it is bread. His method involves 3 essential tenets: more hydration, more fermentation, and more heat in the oven. Today on the podcast, Jonathan and I talk in depth about this philosophy, about more hydration, fermentation, and heat. He talks about his formulas that he has honed for over 30 years of working in his Hungry Ghost bakery, and all along with his formulas for sourdough loaves, flatbreads, crackers, and more. We talk about this ancient bread making tradition. We talk about modern things that he does in his bakery to support the sweet tooth that often his customers have. And we also, of course, talk about his publishing journey, the story behind getting a book deal, and bringing his bread making philosophy and formulas to print. So whether you're a bread baking enthusiast or you simply love the smell of fresh sourdough, I hope this episode inspires you to read his book. It's a really a beautiful little book full of text. It'd be great for reading and also get it into the kitchen this winter and doing a lot more baking if you are in the Northern Hemisphere. So without further delay, let's dive into this interview with Jonathan Stevens. Hi, Jonathan. Welcome to the Cookbook Love podcast.
Thank you, Maggie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you here to talk about a topic I've covered before related to different authors, different books, but a subject that is timeless. And before we dive in, though, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm a bread baker. I live in Western Massachusetts. I have a little shop in Northampton, which is a college town. That's where Smith College is. They're actually our landlord. And Cheryl and I have been running our shop there for 20 years. And before that, I was a stay-at-home dad. I was a social worker. I was a songwriter, a carpenter. I've been not very good at a lot of different jobs. And I decided that being my own boss was the best thing. And so I figured out something about this bread baking thing.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your bakery?
The bakery is the Hungry Ghost Bread. And it's open 7 days a week. We have a wood-fired oven. We do all naturally leavened loaves. We have a pastry department in the back that we like to say supports our bread making habit, because often, customers will come in and they'll say, well, that bread, is there organic flour? Is there any sweetener there? Is it pure? Is it good for me? And I'll take 6 cookies. It happens every day. We say, you want to know what's in the cookie? No,
just the bread.
Just the bread. And we're an open shop. That is, you come in and there's a counter there. I mean, you can't just waltz all the way in, but there's a tiny little customer area. And then you see the oven. You can see right in the oven. It's vast. You can see our bench with the dough on it. You can hear the mixer cranking away, and you hear whatever music I happen to want to listen to that day. So it's like being in my kitchen.
Yeah.
And it's hot. It's hot in there. So it's a little experience.
Yeah. So it's funny, cookies. What is it about people wanting to buy cookies? Like, I know they like the bread, but I've said this on the podcast a million times. People that listen all the time have heard me talk about cookies, but people are fascinated with cookies. They like to make them at home. They like to buy them at bakeries. They like books about them. Cookies. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm glad it's supporting your bread baking.
Yeah, right. I can't really eat them that much. I had my sugar period, sugar feeding period as a child.
Yeah.
And I come from a long line of sweet tooth people, but I can't actually eat sugar that much. It gives me a headache.
Yeah.
I don't mind that people buy cookies, but I think they see they're micro luxuries. That's why people, it's a treat they give themselves. And yes, it must go down a different tube than the bread goes down.
I think it does. What's the most favorite cookie flavor at your bakery?
Oh, the chocolate chip cookie.
Chocolate chip. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Most definitely.
Anyway, we'll get out of cookies and we'll go back.
And when my kids were small, when I bake cookies at home for my kids, I always used to use malt, because I didn't like white sugar.
Yeah.
And I think my children are scarred for life by that. They tell me that
they can't stand it.
They can't stand it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's too bad. Anyway, chocolate chip cookies. There we go. Another vote for chocolate chip cookies. And I love that you have it available, because if your customers want something, it's good to have the bread, good to have the pastry. But let's talk a little bit about your bread and the bread that you sell, and a little bit about the bakery itself. And I'm particularly thinking about what you wrote in the introduction to your book, describing the physicalness of the work that you do. And, that this bakery is more than just a place where you're baking bread every day and selling it. It's more than that.
It is more than that. And physically, I mean, bread baking is just a demanding pastime. You have to haul 50-pound bags of flour around, and then you're throwing them in the mixer. I have to reach into that mixer and adjust the water and add the salt and add the inclusions. And I'm right up personal with that dough. All mixers have to be You get your hands all sticky, and hopefully your mixer is not a planetary mixer, or else you got to watch out for your
Yeah.
hands.
Yeah.
I have a spiral mixer so that moving part stays in the back and my hand is in the front, and it's all safe. But you're down in there adjusting stuff and feeling the dough, and then you got to haul it out of there and put it in the bin. And then over the next few hours, you got to again dive into it and fold it. You give it these big folds, and then you got to lift this. My bins of dough at that point weigh 115 pounds, maybe. So I don't lift those by myself anymore.
Mhm.
I did for a little while, and it's kind of stupid. So two of us lift that up onto the table, and you have to wrestle this thing and fold it, and then of course you're shaping the dough, and you got to feel it. You got to be in contact with it with your nerve endings and your fingers. So it's telling you how ready it is, how developed the gluten is, how warm or cold the dough is. You have to be kind of parenting it along its way,
Yeah.
the whole way.
Yeah.
And then you put it in the cooler. I ferment my dough overnight. I put it in a retarder. It's a walk-in cooler that's set at 41 degrees. But I have to basically pretend that my skin is dough, and decide, oh, do I leave the skirt up and let the dough cool down a little bit, or no, I have to let it stay out in the room. So I have to think like a blob of dough,
Yes.
actually.
Yeah.
And then the next morning I have to haul it out and make some more judgments and see how hot the oven is, and do that whole thing. So I'm always moving around, and then I got to run to the back of the oven and make a fire.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means going outside and splitting some wood.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's in between riding my bike to work and back,
Right.
because I have to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think whether people they're making bread at home, based on what I've read in your book, I think we're going to encourage people to be as physical with what they're doing in terms of testing for certain things. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, and like how people can actually involve their senses while they're baking their bread.
Mhm.
But why the name Hungry Ghost for your bakery?
Well, hungry ghost, there's kind of two meanings. The formal meaning comes from Buddhist theology. A hungry ghost is kind of a scary spirit of insatiable desire. And I learned about that hanging out with these Japanese monks and nuns about almost 40 years ago. And they set a place at the table for this absent person. And I asked them about that, and they said, "Oh, it's like setting a place for Elijah at Passover, only
Yes.
it's
Yes.
it's not a friendly spirit like Elijah." And that just struck me. It struck me that when we make food of any kind, what appetite are we trying to fulfill? Are we trying to feed other people? Are we trying to feed something in ourselves? And then physically, what are we doing with that food? Are we making sure that it gets to human beings? Um, there's an elaborate ritual to free these hungry ghosts. Hungry ghosts are scary. My friend, this Japanese monk, Katashoni, he tells me he loves the bread, but he says the name of the bakery is too scary.
He doesn't like it.
He doesn't love it, but it implies a set of questions that I think we need to ask ourselves every time we make food.
Yeah.
Why do we have enough food ourselves? Are we sharing any extra? And what is the intent of
Yeah.
our making this food? Now, when little kids come to visit the bakery and they ask about the ghost, I don't give them this spiel. I just show them the bucket with the starter in, and I say, "That's the ghost in there," and it bubbles at them. And then I said, "This is the ghost," and the ghost is farting.
Yes.
And they remember that. And essentially, it's true. That's what the digestion is doing. That's why you get the air bubbles in the crumb of the bread. So that's why in the book we have a chapter called "Getting Started with Ghost Farts," because that's where the Buddhist theology meets the childhood imagination.
Correct. And that's exactly what you want this starter to do, is be bubbling up. You know what else I think of when I think of ghosts is all the natural yeast that are in the air that we can't
Mhm.
see, or on our skin, or wherever they are in the environment, being collected in your hands, being collected into the flour, the starter, and the yeast has to come from somewhere. Yeah.
That's right. And that's the dance we're doing. That's the collaboration that bread bakers need to understand, um, that we're only part of what's going on when we make bread.
Yeah.
There's all these invisible, ghostly parts, as you say. And people have to embrace that. I think many, many home bakers are afraid. They're afraid of killing their starter. They're afraid of the dough running away and taking over their fridge or their oven or whatever. And I think that's symptomatic of our fear of nature, honestly. Um, and that's not a good way to be is
Right, because
afraid.
with this, we don't want to tame it. We really want to invite it in to like be part of the process. So I have a question for you. If you were to up and move to another state, let's just say wherever it might be, you move to another state, would your process for making bread be different because the yeast are different there, or is it pretty much like you could just pick up where you left off in Massachusetts?
That's an excellent question. I would think that
I don't know if there's terroir to it. Like, you hear in France, like the reason that certain foods taste like they do, or even in Kentucky, we have this little loose leaf head of Bib lettuce that grows very well because we have a lot of limestone water.
right,
Same for the bourbon industry and corn
sure,
and
sure.
it's limestone water. So I didn't know if yeast and wild yeast and have that kind of same thing.
Well, they do and they don't. I gotta say that I think terroir
Yeah.
um is it's not a word I tend to use because I think foodies use that as an intimidating word. Like the French vocabulary gets mined in order to be kind of elitist,
Yeah.
if you know
Yeah.
what I
Yeah.
mean.
I know what you
And I
mean.
grew up speaking French in Canada. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just another language, right?
Right. Right.
It's not inherently smarter about food. Um, I think the soil matters when you're growing grapes and when you're maybe even when you're growing
Growing
wheat.
wheat.
But by the time you get to the bread, you're right that the inherent terroir is in the starter, right? The flavor comes from the flour, but a lot of it comes from the starter and how you're dealing and handling your dough and managing your dough. Now, a starter will change depending on, as you said, the baker's hands and what's in the wheat and partly where you are. If you're in San Francisco and you're in a fog all the
Hmm.
time, there's
Hmm.
going to be a different starter. But once you've established a starter, it it tends to, I think, have a certain stability. Now, I haven't done that myself. I haven't taken my starter, which happens to be a Cousin humilis, and I found that out in a weird way through Rob Dunn's laboratory in North Carolina.
Yeah.
But there are starters like that around the country. Um, so it's not just where you are, it's also who you are and what wheat you're using. Your bread making might change in terms of altitude. If I was living in the top of the Rockies,
Yeah. For
hydration
sure.
would change
Yeah.
for sure. So there are definitely variations that happen, but the warmth of your kitchen is extremely important.
Okay.
And the cleanliness of your water is very important
Yeah. So
too.
water, flour, the natural yeast. Do you put salt in yours?
Oh yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And
yeah,
then like you said, you have some inclusions or add-ins to some of the
that's
recipes
right.
that you would add. Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. I think an interesting question. And of course, when you think of sourdough, I mean, San Francisco is a classic example of a place where it was always kind of known for its sourdough and um, became kind of part of the food of that city. Like people knew you could go out there and get sourdough. Of course, I think that you really start to look at towns and university towns across the country. Like there's always been little bakeries, I think, that have been making bread and selling bread. And doing things like you're doing without even being anywhere near San Francisco, obviously. So,
Well, sure. That's a epiphenomenon of the gold rush.
yeah.
That's why we think of San Francisco as the sourdough thing, because a lot of gold miners
Yes.
made their way out there with their little starters.
Right. They were desiring the gold, right? But they went right. Talk about
Yeah.
the hungry ghost, like the things that we actually desire.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about your book. And you made a transition. You decided at some point you're going to tell us a story about why a book. What led you from being a bread baker, running a bakery, 7-day a week operation, to wanting to write your book, The Hungry Ghost Bread Book?
Well, there's a few stages to it. One of it is that, I've always written, and for years I've written songs and I write poems, and we joke that the bakery is actually just a very elaborate front for a vanity press, because we put poems on the back of our bread schedule and we put those in with the loaves of bread. It's a little demoralizing to realize that most customers have no idea. They never see the poem on the back of there, but whatever. I do it for myself.
Yeah.
Um,
Is that true? Do know some not realize it?
Oh, for years. I don't know. There's people who've been coming to me for 10, 20 years, and then they'll come in one day and they'll say, "There's a poem on the back of this bread schedule."
Oh, I see what you're saying. Like all of a sudden it just appeared when it had really been there the whole time.
It's been there the whole time. And we switch them up. We change them up every month or 2 weeks or something. And say, "Hey, who wrote that?
Yeah.
Where'd you get the poem?"
Yeah. That's neat.
And a little bit of it's just the grandiosity of, like, of course I'd like to write a book. We all, who doesn't want to have written a book?
Yeah.
But I also felt that at a certain point, we had established a certain approach to bread making that wasn't that well documented. And if there was a book I had that could have magically appeared when I started out 30 years ago, this is the book that I wish I had in hand, that explained things in a particular way, and that sometimes it's just unavoidable. Essentially, the dough, the bread will teach you how to make it, but if you could cut that very long process a little shorter, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. So this is just one approach to making bread. I don't pretend that it's like comprehensive, and it's really many variations on one approach, but it's an approach that I think maximizes nutrition and maximizes taste, and was worth talking about. So that's kind of why I put that together.
Yeah. Tell us about the style of the book, like the design of it and the layout of the book, and the way that it might differ from a modern bread cookbook that someone might see if it were side by side with your book in a bookstore.
Well, as we know, there's two kinds of bread books, essentially. There's the coffee table, glossy, fancy looking, photographic bread books. And then there's the quieter on the side. Maybe the spine will get broken and the pages will get covered and smeared with flour and water. Mine is that second kind. Not necessarily because I wanted it that way. That was just the way it was going to be. I'm not a celebrity baker. There was no danger of my coming out with a nice big glossy bread book. But as we all know, I got to confess, I don't really like those big glossy bread books because their function is generally to make people feel ashamed of the bread that they're not making.
Yeah.
And that's a harsh statement, but I feel that pretty strongly. There's a whole class of bread books out there that are basically the Instagram world of it's a platonic ideal of what bread is supposed to look like. And if you can't do this, you're a loser.
And you shouldn't even try.
Right. Don't even bother. You can't do it. And if you don't have the nice bespoke apron and the proper, tattoo on your whatever. And it's like, I'm not into that. I've never been into that. Not that I was ever invited into that club, but like, oh, well, that's just not my approach.
Yeah.
And it's obviously that's not the way most bread has been baked for 10,000 years. That's just kind of a weird little frothy, part of the celebrity culture in this country. And that's the way it is. And doesn't mean all those people are bad people. I know
Right.
some of those people, that's
Right.
fine.
Right.
But that's not how you're going to learn how to make bread. Mostly you're going to learn how to make bread without books. The dough is just going to smack you upside the head. But if you can find actual useful information, you're going to tend to find it places that don't have glossy pictures. So this is one of those books. Honestly, the formatting model for this book, kind of by accident, but it's the Tassajara bread book, right? It's modest, it's small, it has drawings, not expensive to print. And that's one of the first books I learned on. And that was a very important book when it came out. So that's kind of the model.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think that it's important for people to understand that when we write books, the book needs to be a reflection of who we are. And if it's not, it won't be anything you want to talk about. It won't want to be anything that you want to even be near, because it's not really a reflection of you. It's just like my first cookbook I modeled after the Moosewood style. Was a paperback with illustrations. I didn't want photos because I love the style of those books. I love the thought of going into that restaurant and knowing that I could get something. I almost could imagine the kind of food I would eat there based on the kind of book it was. And people are like, well, it's a paperback. You won't be able to release the second edition in paperback. So it doesn't matter. That's what I wanted from the beginning anyway.
That's great.
So, and I think for this book, it's important that people know that if you, not just, it's a reflection of who you are, what your bakery is, your philosophy about bread, but it looks like a great little book to sit down with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or a beer, whatever you want to drink, and read this book. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So I wanted to make it narrative.
Yeah.
Right.
Definitely.
And imbue it with some personality.
Right.
So that it was engaging to people.
Yeah.
And so there's stories in there, and there's just kind of associative, whatever metaphors, and imagine this, but that's, it's just a way of engaging. That bread is a currency that allows us to talk to farmers and millers and customers and other people who eat bread, and for bakers to talk to one another.
Yeah.
So I'm just sharing my technique. When I first started out, there were other bakers just starting out, and we'd call each other on the phone. I was just visiting Barack Owens up at Zoo Bakery in Portland the other day. He won the James Beard Award last year for the best baker. Yeah. And he reminded me, oh yeah, 25, 30 years ago, we were on the phone to each other saying, oh my God, this thing happened. Like, what do you do?
Yeah.
And how long do you leave it in the fridge? We were basically practicing peer education. That's what this book is meant to do with other bakers. Like, hey, this is the little bit I figured out.
Yeah. And I think that, sharing our processes and sharing a technique we might have for something also makes making bread yours, because you're sharing the way that you do it, which would be different from, like you said, the way that other bakers are doing it. And when I learn how to do it, or if I'm baking bread at home already, I can incorporate some of the things that you teach into what I already do. And you say in the introduction also that this is a book version of your bakery, right? So let's talk about your three main things for bread baking that you think that you learned, that you probably harp on all the time for the work that you're doing, and that you think that home bakers need to think about when they're baking bread.
Sure. Well, yeah, the short version of the book is more hydration, more fermentation, and more heat in the oven. Okay. A lot of the bread that I see out there in the world, if I'm traveling, or you can sometimes just see it in a picture, is that people, again, are afraid. They're afraid of their dough. They're afraid of too much water in there. They're afraid of fermentation at all. They don't understand it, and they don't do it. And they're afraid of baking the bread, of actually, baking it. A lot of the bread I see out there in the world is underbaked. And no matter how you fermented it, underbaked bread is not good for your digestion. It's got to be dark. White, if it looks white on the outside, that's not good.
Yeah.
It's not going to be good for your body. Giving it life, you want to be working with something that feels lively. Dough is not meant to be dead and something that's just manipulated and gone through a process. Again, like we were talking about, it's a collaboration. You got to give it enough water and starter for it to talk to you, essentially.
Yeah.
The fermentation is absolutely necessary. And we're talking about sourdough starter. Just to be clear, that the part of the problem in English is we only have the word yeast. In French, of course, you have two different words. One's for levure and one's for levain. This is levain. It's different than packaged yeast, right?
Yeah.
It's natural yeast. We're actually yeast farmers. I have a starter. I feed it twice a day. It's a whole world of microbiology happening in there, of cultures and wild yeasts. And that's what neutralizes the phytic acids in the wheat. Wheat always naturally occurring phytic acids, PHYTIC. And phytic acids inhibit our human ability to absorb nutrients. You have to neutralize the phytic acid in order to access the nutrients in wheat. So that's why I say, in a kind of a radical fundamentalist statement, that a yeasted bread, a straight dough bread, isn't really bread, and your body can't access it. It looks like bread, it smells like bread. Your body can't get at it. Your digestion can't break it down. You have to start breaking it down in the dough. That's what the fermentation is doing. That's what it does in pickles and all the rest of it. It's beginning the digestion for you, because we're not cows. We're not ruminants. We don't have four stomachs. We're standing up. We got these great big brains. We should use them more than we do.
Yeah.
And fermenting our bread dough is one of those really good ways of using them. And so that breaks the phytic acids down. It pre-digests a bunch of those nutrients and the starches. And then by the time we put it in our bodies, it's ready to give us what our bodies need. And we have to bake that bread thoroughly in order for that, again, for those starches to be broken down. And so we're not eating raw dough.
Yeah.
Raw dough is not good for the human body.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for the water people might use to hydrate their starter or their bread?
Oh, the actual water? Well,
Yeah.
you don't want to use highly chlorinated water. I think it's pretty important. Clearly, chlorine is there to kill off germs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's good if there's germs in your water, but there's bacteria in our starters that we don't want to kill off. So I use filtered water. If you can filter your water, use spring water, but do not use highly chlorinated water.
Okay. Yep. And what about the type of flour?
There's a lot more leeway there.
Yeah.
For your starter, you can use all kinds of stuff. I use a quarter rye flour. Rye flour tends to have a lot more enzymatic activity. But I also use white flour in there. Some people use whole wheat flour. You want to use something that's not old and rancid and been sitting around your pantry for a million years. But you can make starters. We talk about this in the book. You can make starters out of bran, out of all rye, out of cornmeal, for that matter. You have to take care of your starter. It's now you have a new pet, and just get into the rhythm of feeding it once a day. Don't keep putting it away in the fridge. Get a crock. Just make a part of your daily thing, whether you're gonna use it every day or not. Just feed it. throw some of it away and feed it. And when throwing away a little bit of extra starter, it's not a sin.
I mean, and I think it's important you say that because I think some people are concerned about what do I do with this extra starter?
People get really worked up. They think they have to eat pancakes every day of their lives. That's just not true. Or that they're supposed to be doing something with it. It's just a little water and flour.
Yeah.
It's really okay. You probably start a compost.
Yeah.
Do you have a garden? Yeah.
Usually.
Yeah.
I think I have a friend who has backyard chickens. I think is it possible she feeds her starter to her chickens?
You'd have to dry it out a little bit. Yeah, unless her chickens can, use really wide straws.
Yeah, so I almost am positive she told me that, but I didn't ask her any details about the straws or how she did it. Yeah, but yeah, so if you don't have chickens, just get rid of it, but feed it regularly. And then the fermentation part is that's part of the bread baking after you shape the dough or after you.
No, that's in your mixing. So it's like the first thing you put. Whether you're using a mixer, you're just using your hands. If you're not making a lot, just use your hands. You don't need a mixer. You pour in the water and the flour and then the starter.
Yeah.
It's right from the beginning. You need that starter, and you need your starter, as you said, bubbling and talking to you. It needs to be literally active. You don't take it out of the fridge and pour it in the mixing bowl and wonder why it's not happening. It's got to be bubbling and wanting to go to work. And you weigh out how much you need. I mean, I use 12% of I do everything by weight, baker's percentages, and we use 12%. But maybe you don't do it that way. Maybe you do it by volume. That's, you wouldn't want to make a lot of bread with measuring with little cups and spoons, but people do it.
Yeah.
A lot of people throughout history haven't measured anything. They go by feel. That's how, whatever it is, if your starter's not vigorous, it's not going to work. If you take care of your starter, it'll take care of you. We call it the mother for a reason, right?
That's right.
So take care of your mother. Be nice to your mother. She'll take care of you. Put it in your dough. It'll get your dough going. And yes, it'll take you a little while to get the rhythm of what's happening, how long your dough. So the biggest difference, honestly, between my bakery and somebody's home is that I feed the starter twice a day. So my starter's really vigorous, but my space is really warm. It's downright hot in the summertime. So you want a warm kitchen. Now, if you don't have a warm kitchen, you probably want a seed mat or something to keep your mixing bowl warm. You don't need to heat the whole house or heat the whole room, but you do need some warmth around your dough.
Yeah.
So you might want to use warm water to mix with. So those are the kinds of things that I can't all predict in a book. Nobody can say use exactly this temperature because we can't. There's so many variables. I don't know about the flour you got or how.
Right, and the flour, if you're storing it in the freezer or something like that, and you take it out, it just makes a nice cold loaf, and that's not what you want.
That's not what you want.
Right.
So the challenging thing for bakers of all kinds, but for home bakers in particular, is to don't get discouraged the first time. Be dedicated to a practice. It's a practice. It's like learning the piano or doing yoga or, whatever.
Writing poems.
Writing a poem or running around the block.
Right.
The first time is going to be hard. The second time is going to be hard. But if you persist, you are going to get a rhythm. You're going to learn. There'll be a feedback loop. And you're going to get the rhythm of it. You're going to get the hang of it. But you have to establish the parameters so that you know what it is you think you're trying to learn and what the lessons are, right? Yeah. So you don't change all the variables every single time. I mean, that's kind of standard empirical learning, right?
Otherwise, you don't know at all what made a difference, right?
Right. So you change, one variable at a time.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Very good.
That's what you do in home baking.
Yeah. And let's talk about the heat for the oven, I think.
Yeah.
And like if
Yep.
you have tips for home ovens, like how hot, is there things to make it hotter? Do I need steam? All that stuff.
Sure. Well, the most important thing is to not trust what temperature it says it is, because most home ovens are not the temperature that they say they are. So the cheap, easy first solution is you go to the grocery store and you get one of those little temperature gauges, independent little metal things that you hang in your oven, and that'll tell you what temperature it actually is. So that's a first good way to start. See how hot you can get it. Can you get it to 450 degrees? Can you get it to 500? Dutch ovens are really a great way to bake bread where you don't need a fancy cloche and you don't need a pizza peel. I mean, if you have a pizza peel, give that a shot. But honestly, a Dutch oven, one of those big casseroles with the top, if you have a high hydration dough, a lot of water in the dough, they trap that water in there. That's what's going to give you the steam. So it's like replicating a little masonry oven.
Yes.
Is that Dutch oven.
Yes.
Most people have those. They make fancy ones that are essentially upside down. So you put the lid is the bottom and the rest is the. Just make sure you have very good oven mitts so that you don't burn yourself while you're fiddling
I've
around the
often
pot.
wondered as I'm thinking about this if I could take the knob off my Dutch oven and turn it over so that it's flat. You know what I mean? Flat on the counter when I
Yeah,
bake bread, and then put the
yeah,
knob back on when I want to make
hmm
soup or stew.
yeah.
I have
Give
to look
it a
into that.
shot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it seems to me that Dutch oven technique though, is it as new as it seems like it? Like it's all of a sudden people just started talking
Yeah.
about it, but was it like something that someone just like resurrected from like an an older way of doing things?
I would assume so.
Yeah. 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 All right. So that covers the hydration, the
Yeah.
fermentation, and the heat. The three most important things
Yeah.
that you think that people need to really focus on when we make bread at
And
home.
and essentially push the limits of those things. I mean, what's
Hotter.
the worst? What's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to end up throwing it on the compost. I mean, it's not, you
Right.
know, nothing really bad is going to happen.
Yeah.
And that the edge of excellence is always near disaster,
Well, and
right?
like you said,
That's
the
how it
edge
goes.
of to get the best view, you got to go to the edge of the cliff,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Or to look
Yeah.
down and see the Kentucky River and the
Yeah,
Palisades, you got to get to
exactly.
the edge of wherever it
Right.
is. Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And
Okay.
and that's scarier than actually like putting extra water in your dough, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Very good. So those are all great tips. So my question next is then, how did you take all this knowledge from the years of your um, working in the bakery, making bread, making mistakes, figuring things out? And what was your process to get the book published and turn it into a book?
Well, there have been many iterations of this book along the way, and um, clearly the early iterations were not viable. They were loaves that I had to throw on the compost pile for various reasons. Um, I, for one, maybe it just wasn't the right time. You have to find the right person. Maybe I didn't have the information collated. Just because you think you're ready doesn't mean you're ready. But one of the things that I essentially had to take out, one of the earlier versions had too much personality. Essentially, it was too subjective, and it leaned too heavily on what I think of as kind of metaphorical learning. So I had a lot of poems about making bread, like writing poems about bread. To me, bread is just one of those things that absorbs metaphor, just like it absorbs soup stock,
Yeah.
you know? No, that doesn't mean that other people always understand or like the poems, but hey, that's how poems work. Um, but I was under the impression that that was one way that other people could kind of learn about the nature of the bread, and the nature of bread making, and it just didn't translate for people. So for the last time I decided, okay, I'm gonna try this book project again. I just decided to leave out the word poetry completely. It had occurred to me that the secret weapon of poetry is that it repels money, and that I do plenty of repelling money in my life. And in this case, I was going to try at least, if not to attract it, at least not to repel it. So I didn't mention it. I didn't put the word poetry in my book proposal, and bingo.
Yeah.
It coincidentally, I got somewhere. Now, I ended up sneaking a couple of poems in there because my editor is a nice person and she thought it would be fine. But it was definitely sneaking it in. And so I came at it from a more objective point of view, which might surprise people who read the book because it is pretty subjective.
It is subjective, but right.
But it's
Must
less
have been a lot
subjective.
less subjective than
Exactly,
it was.
believe it or not.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how that went. And I had a great editor at Chelsea Green.
Did you pitch them directly or did you go through an agent?
No, I pitched to them directly.
Great. Yeah. And it's perfect. The kind of publisher they are, the kind of topics that they write and publish, it fits. It fits.
It really
perfect.
does.
Yeah.
It does. And so I just went through it. We figured out which kind of recipes we do and how much kind of narrative there would be, and I felt like I had a lot of leeway. I didn't get shut down a lot.
That's great.
It was not a compromise.
Yeah. You have 15 blurbs, endorsements from friends, I guess, people that people you've communicated with over the years, shared tips. I don't know, Baker. I see Sandor Katz is in here who wrote the great fermentation books. And wonderful. Yeah. So I like reading all the blurbs. I think it's always fun to do that. And really gives you kind of a feel for the type of people that, value this type of work that you're doing and, want to connect their name with your work. And I think it's great to have them in there.
Well,
I do want to talk. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that bakers make a really nice community. I mean, for one thing, a lot of us bakers are kind of stuck in our shops. So when we get out and we finally, meet somebody else who does what we do, we're thrilled to be able to share notes. But we also know that it's not like musicians in the sense that you can't be proprietary about bread. Bread is so much vaster than any one of us that it's not like, oh, it's my bread and it's your bread. It's just bread. We're all servants to the bread.
Yeah.
So we're all we're all minions at the feet of, Demeter or whatever. And so we're very much on an equal playing field.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a great way to be. But, I think about musicians, it's still just the same number of notes and sharps and flats. I think it's fascinating the different. If you really stop and think about that and how much music is out there with just that, that bit of information that people can scramble up in an infinite number of ways. It's fascinating. And I think that if you take the number of bakers, though, and the simplicity of the ingredients, you get different kinds of loaves. You get different ways people shape it.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I want to talk about crackers.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think some of the best things to bake at home that actually are very approachable and easy, a good way to start is by making crackers.
Agreed.
And I think that once people learn how to do it, you won't go back to store-bought crackers.
No way. No. Most crackers that you buy in the store look and taste exactly like the boxes that they come in.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
And and the fancy ones are just packaging.
Right.
And you can spend a lot of money on really yucky crackers. Agreed. Crackers are an excellent entry into learning about flour and learning about fermentation, because you do want to ferment your crackers a little bit. But it's basically taking out the performance anxiety, because you're not worried about loftiness of a loaf or whatever,
or having to cut the top in with the razor blade or anything like that. You don't have to worry about any of that. You don't have to worry about a Dutch oven.
No.
Right. So would you walk us through maybe a simple basic cracker, perhaps with some of the ways that it might be seasoned or used?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you actually first the easiest, simplest recipe in the whole book is for matzah. And there's no measurements and there's no weights of anything, and there's no salt and there's no fermentation because it's matzah for Passover. So it's just spelt flour and water, and you have like 18 minutes to do it because that's kind of the rule, right? Before the wild yeast come down and start colonizing the dough, and the Egyptian army catches up with you, you know.
Right.
So, but it liberates you essentially from all that other stuff, from the scale and the worry and the this and the too many ingredients. You got 2 ingredients. And the third ingredient is you, as usual, you know. And so there's a radical simplicity to that that's really freeing. And to kind of continue with the sort of the musical analogy, you're freeing yourself from the sheet music. You know what I mean? You don't have to look at the book to say, okay, what do I do next? It's like, no, it's you and the dough. And the instructions are just so basic that you put the book aside and you really face the instrument, you know, because the music's coming out of you. It's not coming out of the sheet music, right?
Right.
And you just get in there with the water and the flour and you mix it till you know what? You can't mix it anymore. And then you cut it up and you roll it out till you can't roll it out anymore. And then you put it in the oven. And that's pretty much it. I mean, if you can, you dock it so that it doesn't puff up with a little rolling docker. And if you can, you have a little crimper, you roll that so it breaks cleanly. That's all there is to it. You want to make slightly more complicated crackers. Yes, you add some water. I mean, some salt as well as the water and some starter. And the starter, as ever, is going to make it more digestible and make it taste more interesting. You don't want it to sit around like a bread dough does, because that starter will actually break down the gluten and starches, and so it won't be easy to roll out. So I only let my crackers dough sit around for a couple hours. But that's all it is water and flour and salt and some starter. And then again, you just roll it out, you dock it. If you have an offset spatula to loosen it up so it doesn't stick to whatever you're rolling it on. But maybe you're rolling it on parchment paper, you put that on your sheet pan, you put it in the oven.
Yep.
That's all there is to it.
Yeah, it's really, they're just delicious. So I mentioned that as a word of encouragement. You do have a little section on crackers. It's a good entry point. It's something a little bit different, I think. Isn't it fun to be known as someone who can make their own crackers?
Yeah.
And you take your own crackers to a party, people will be like inviting you back to the party.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And yes, inclusions, easy ones, sesame seeds, flax seeds. You want to put things in there that aren't going to get in the way of you rolling, that won't extrude, basically. Inclusions that won't extrude.
Yeah.
Right. You want flat little seeds. Sometimes I put some sage. I make a semolina sage. So a little bit of herb, something like that. Yeah. Not too crazy. And you can play around with different flours, of course, where the strength of the gluten isn't as important. So you could use non-glutinous flours too. You got to have something to hold it together, but you don't have to worry about that so much.
Yeah. I think I used cornmeal once, but it recommended to use boiling water, and the cornmeal then swelled up a little bit. And of course, in the South, we use cornmeal, right? And it made this, and I think it had pumpkin seeds in it and maybe sunflower seeds, and you rolled it out. It was kind of like, there's a Swedish flatbread, I think, that it was kind of modeled after.
Interesting.
It was really good. Didn't have any starter in it, though. It was, no, but they were delicious. I mean, that's the kind of thing, like, you break them or put them in a bowl, or people could have them, with some other, whatever you're having, cheeses or dips or whatever. They're just so good.
Yeah, they'll disappear. I mean,
you're like, who made the crackers, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, so I love that there were crackers in here, and I think it's a great place for people to start.
Absolutely.
So, what have we missed related to your book or your bread philosophy or your bakery?
Oh, I just want to encourage people to not be afraid to really engage with it. Think of it as like a dance class you're going to, you know? You're not going to be great the first time. You're not going to make the Instagram love. Don't worry about the image. The form is not as important as the content. I've always been a content over form person. You know, bread, I mean, I like it when the bread looks nice, but that's not what it's all about. We don't really eat with our eyes. We really eat with our mouths,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know? Um, and we're not sculptors here, and we're not artists. I mean, sometimes people say, oh, the baker is an artist. The baker is not an artist. Okay. The baker is a craftsperson. A baker is not merely expressing themselves. I mean, our idiosyncrasies get expressed in the different ways that our breads come out, but it's not about self-expression in that way. It's about craft. It's about stepping into a millennial long tradition that's ongoing. It's a stream, it's a river that's been flowing for a very long time,
right.
and you're stepping into it and getting what you can, and maybe you're contributing to it, or you're diverting it a little bit here and there, and you're trying some different flours. But it's a vast river, and there's many different ways of approaching it. Let's talk about flours a little bit.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Um, One thing I always tell home bakers is if they want to use whole wheat flour, they shouldn't be buying it in the store. Um, Not conventional whole wheat flour. If they can find a fresh whole wheat flour, locally milled, by all means buy it. The dirty little secret about whole wheat flour that you buy in the store is that it's probably rancid.
Hmm.
The thing about wheat that we all used to know that we don't know anymore because none of us grow our own wheat. It's a grass, right? The wheat seed, which is at the head of the grass, it's like a little egg, right? There's bran on the outside, that's the shell, and then there's the endosperm, it's like the egg white, and then there's the yolk, which is the wheat germ. Okay, and that's where all the good stuff is in the wheat germ, is the proteins and the oils and all that stuff. When you make whole wheat flour, you're just crumbling, you're just grinding that whole thing up, and you get all the bran and all the endosperm and all the germ. The oils in that germ start to oxidize the minute you crack it open. Before that, it's pretty stable. You can hold on to wheat berries for a very long time at a good temperature. The oils start to oxidize, and they're not going to last that long. Again, depending on temperature and storage. I wouldn't want to use whole wheat flour that's older than a couple weeks. I guarantee you, whatever whole wheat flour you buy in a grocery store that's off of, conventional bag, it's older than 2 weeks. It was milled another part of the country, and it spent time in a warehouse, and then again it was in a truck, and then it was in another truck, and then it was in the back of your store, and then it's on the shelf of your store.
Mhm.
So the whole wheat bread you're going to make isn't really going to be that good. Those enzymes have gone away. They have evaporated. So that's part of the reason why all those like hippie loaves back in the 70s weren't really very tasty and not lofty because the flour wasn't good. So bakers of all kinds, but home bakers particularly ought to get a countertop mill. It'll bring you that much closer to the process. If you're only using a few cups of flour, it's not really that onerous. You could get a hand crank. You could get a fancy German mill, a mock mill, whatever. There's a ton of these things. They're not all expensive. The difference will be radical. The difference in flavor and the difference in enzymatic activity will be radically different. That's an important thing for home bakers to know. White flour, oddly enough, is the opposite. You don't want fresh white flour. Now, you're not in most home bakers are not in any danger of getting fresh white flour. Commercial bakers are, because we're getting, a pallet full from the mill or from our distributor, and sometimes they need to sit around. That's why they used to bromate them and stuff, right? Because they want to oxidize. It's counterintuitive, but if you can, and again, home bakers have the advantage, they're not buying a pallet full of flour. They can buy fancy flour. They can buy organic flour. I would recommend that, honestly. Better for the farmer, better for the soil. But you can also buy specialty flours. You can buy some spelt or some Coruscant, some semolina. So home bakers, because you're using such small ingredients, that's why I don't make like chocolate bread or cherry bread, because I can't afford, a ton of cherries or chocolate to throw in my bread. If you're making 2 loaves, you can do that. So I would encourage people to get good ingredients and high quality ingredients and fresh ingredients. If you're going to put inclusions in there like herbs, put enough that you can taste it. There's no point in holding back. Usually in a bread dough, you have to exaggerate. It's not like a cookie or it's not a subtle thing because of all that water and all that flour and the baking that happens. Little inclusions will get overwhelmed. So you have to really, really exaggerate. You have to put stuff in there.
Yeah, very good. And I think it's interesting about the white flour needing to be older and the wheat flour needing to be, I'm going to say younger, but like fresher.
Yeah.
And that's a benefit of milling. And I'm sure there are mills that people can find. People might even already have one, especially if they are listening and they are bakers.
And
You guys
there's a new movement of regional mills that's really wonderful. There's a guy in Vermont building these. It's called New American Mills, and they're sized for bakeries or for small milling operations that, of course, used to be all around the country, and then disappeared with consolidation, and now are coming back again. So,
right. Yeah, amazing. So we're thinking if it's colder, here in the northern hemisphere, we're headed into wintertime, colder weather.
Yep.
People might think of bread baking more in the wintertime, but actually it's kind of counterintuitive again in terms of the temperature of your kitchen.
Well, unless you have a wood stove and a warm, cozy kitchen, which a lot of people do. I mean, people don't often want to run their ovens in the summertime.
Yeah.
So use warm water when you're making your dough. That's a simple way to jumpstart your dough. Use warm water, have a warm space, use a seed mat or something.
Yep.
Get some soup going too,
Yeah. And then the 475 or 500 degree oven, it does feel better being on in the wintertime than in the summertime. Yeah. And if people want to use wood-fired places to bake bread, if they have a hearth, do you have any tips for that?
Be careful. Don't keep your jar of aloe handy. Make sure your leather gloves don't have holes in them.
Yeah.
And as best you can, know what temperature you're working with. There are tricks to throw, if people have temperature guns, but if you lacking that, you throw a little fresh flour on a hot hearth and you count to 8. So if the flour vaporizes immediately and burns, it's too hot. You could bake a pizza on that. But you don't want it that hot for bread.
Yeah.
And you want to be able to seal up the space in order for it to trap any steam. that you're going to have. You can put in a skillet with some water in there that'll boil off and give you some steam, but you got to be able to block the door, so the steam doesn't disappear. But there are a couple of great. One of my favorite bread books is called The Bread Builders. It's also a Chelsea Green book, and excellent book when it comes to talking about the physics of heat in a masonry oven, and also the microbiology of sourdough. It's a terrific book.
Physics and microbiology.
Yeah.
Science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's science, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's neat. Yeah. So if there's I'll link to that in the show notes if anybody's interested in
Great.
looking into that. So one of the things I like to ask my guests is, when you think about other books that you've leaned on, or books that you have been influenced by, sometimes I have my guests share a favorite. We'll put The Bread Builders in. Was that the one that you had in mind? I know I kind of have people prepare for this question, or did you have anything else in mind?
That's definitely one of the top 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Another one is Flatbreads and Flavors by Naim Duguid and Jeffrey Alford. And that's a very different book. That's like a travel food book, but it's about breads of Central Asia, but it's all full of recipes. But what I love about that book is the anthropological dimension, and they basically wrote it while they were riding their bicycles around Central Asia. So the people are back in the story. I'm always disturbed by food books that don't have any people in them.
I know. It's like, where'd the people go?
Where do the people go? And bread and I don't like books that elevate bread to some luxury item that somehow is the food of the gods, and they come down secretly and gobble it up. It's a social glue. That's what bread is for. So they put the people back in there.
Yeah.
And how people what they eat it with. That's why the flavors are in there, because flatbreads are there to scoop up, different kinds of chutneys or whatever. And I adored that. I was also a recovering anthropologist at the time, so it was a nice way to mix my 2 passions. Yeah.
Wonderful. So we'll link to both of those, The Bread Builders and Flatbreads and Flavors, in the show notes. So if people want to connect with you online, Jonathan, or come visit your store, or
absolutely,
how would they be able to do that?
Well, we are, thanks to the younger people in my bakery, we are on social media. We have a Facebook page. It's hungryghostbread.com, and we have we have a website that's hungryghostbread.com. We have a Facebook page. We have an Instagram page. I'm not sure I even know how to get to the Instagram page myself, but anybody under 40 can figure it out. Yes, we're open 7 days a week. People are please come by, get some bread. We're in Northampton, Massachusetts. We're essentially halfway. We're right on 91, Interstate 91, essentially between Connecticut and Vermont. We're north of Springfield and Holyoke and south of Greenfield. I actually do a shadowing project. So people come and spend the day with me.
Oh, nice.
$300 or something. They come and put an apron on, and they follow me around, ask me a million questions. And it's fun. I get to know new people, and they basically walk through a living version of the book.
Yeah.
And that's always fun.
Yeah. So that's called shadowing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a neat opportunity if anybody's interested in spending time with Jonathan at the bakery. And I'm sure there's information about that on your website if people are interested.
That's right.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show to talk all about your book, The Hungry Ghost Bread Book, an offbeat bakery's guide to crafting sourdough loaves, flatbreads, crackers, scones, and more. And we didn't talk about scones. I mean, how in the world did we not talk about scones? But you use the starter in your scones.
Sometimes. Yeah.
Otherwise,
That's more in the pastry department.
Yeah.
They're they're a bunch of anarchists. They don't ask me what I want. They just do what they want.
Where do they bake their cookies and scones? They have a set of like a convection oven, or the hearth oven is for your bread.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I think you need to have companion products. Like you said, it's it all feeds off of each other, no pun intended. And people that come into if they come in on a Saturday, they're picking up some bread for the day, being able to have a scone or a cookie is a bonus.
Oh, it all moves very fast.
Yes, that's good. Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much again, Jonathan. It's great to talk to you about your book, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and maybe get some new friends from our Cookbook Love conversation.
I'm sure I will.
Okay,
a pleasure.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of the Cookbook Love podcast. Again, all the links can be found in the show notes at www.cookbooklove.co. And if you are interested in writing a cookbook of your own, please check out the free cookbook writing masterclass called How to Get Paid to Write a Cookbook. It is designed specifically for food or nutrition experts, and you can check that out at www.cookbookwritersacademy.com/free. So that's it for today's episode of the Cookbook Love podcast. This is your host, Maggie Green. And until next time, have a great day and keep loving your cookbooks.
Thanks for listening to the Cookbook Love podcast. You can find out more information at www.cookbooklove.co.